Aptly Spoken, where Jennifer Courtney, Tim Knotts, and I, Lee Bortons, discuss a book each week from the Classical Conversations curated curriculum. Words Aptly Spoken comes from Proverbs 25:11. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. The written word is a precious treasure. We want to preserve written knowledge for God's glory and as an anchor to the history of the church and its classical conversations. We hope to encourage the reading of words and of the word. It is Wednesday, August 16th, 2023, and today we are also joined by CCMM curriculum developer Stephanie Meter. Jennifer, tell us about this month's shows.
Well, this month might be my favorite of all time because everyone who knows me knows that I love British literature. So already this month we have gotten to delight in Beowulf and Pilgrim's Progress. And today we get to amuse ourselves with Chesterton's Father Brown. And then next week we will record Pride and Prejudice, one of the all-time greats. And then the week after that, C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. So we are truly standing in the company of great giants of British classic literature this month.
Yeah, it's a good selection. So you can access all of our past episodes on my YouTube channel at Lee Bortons or on my website, leebortons.com. And Jennifer, let's get started.
All right. Well, everyone should know by now that my first question is always the same. So Lee, why did you choose Chesterton's Father Brown stories to be in our catalog and our CC curriculum?
Yeah, it fits into the curriculum for so many reasons. First, it's called Favorite Father Brown Stories, and it's published by Dover. And it's just a handful of dollars. One more time, we're trying to make sure our products are affordable to families. And we would like it if every child could get a copy so they can write in them. There's a variety of styles of literature and types of resources in the Classical Conversations curriculum. And this just happens to be a collection of short stories. And it's really just a great place to have them in the curriculum because Challenge 2 students may not be familiar with just the depth of these books because Chesterton brings out theology, insight to human behavior. He's a master at psychology, stories from our characters and allusions to France and England, as well as detective stories, all rolled into one. And attention is the key to solving a Father Brown story. And of course, we're always trying to help our children to attend. Also, Chesterton can be very heady, and it would be a shame for even the casual reader not to be aware of his simple literary adventures, because everything he writes isn't really difficult. So these short stories are a good introduction to one of the most influential Christian writers of the last century. And for those that are curious, they read Father Brown in Challenge 2 after having just read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland and before they read The Hobbit.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that you mentioned the theology and mysteries, because we're going to touch on that here in a little bit and see what kind of connection we can find between those two things. And as you mentioned, Chesterton is a pretty prolific author, and he's also very influential on some of our other favorite authors, like C.S. Lewis. So Tim, tell us a little bit about Chesterton and his prolific nature.
Yeah, so Chesterton lived at the latter part of the 19th century and early 20th century and did pretty well for himself school-wise. He went to St. Paul's School in London, which was a very well-regarded ancient school. But then rather than going on to Oxford or Cambridge, like many of his peers did, he went on to the Slade School of Fine Arts and finally ended up studying literature at University College. So he didn't take quite the academic route that some others like Lewis or Tolkien went. But he did arrive later in his career at writing a lot of literary criticism. And in that, he was extremely well regarded. He had a lot of sparring matches in the media with George Bernard Shaw, who many people probably recognize that name also. They were polar opposites in a lot of ways, politically and socially. Bernard Shaw was a big socialist and into a lot of Nietzsche and stuff in philosophy. And Chesterton was a staunch defender of the Catholic faith and very conservative. as Lee just mentioned, Chesterton was also a good philosopher. He wrote a lot of great stuff that is valuable. His book, The Everlasting Man or Orthodoxy, are both really good books to read when students are a little more mature in their reading habits. And probably one of Chesterton's most famous contributions is his very short biography of St. Thomas Aquinas. That's a lovely little book. Again, pretty approachable. He steers clear of a lot of theology because he knows that he can't really address it all well in such a short treatment of Thomas Aquinas, but that's a good way to get an insight into both Chesterton's writing style and also the life of one of the greatest men of the Middle Ages. But the thing that I love most about Chesterton is that he went to bat for the fact that faith and reason work together, that they're not opposites of one another, but that they are necessarily combined. And in fact, he argued that really only the Christian believer thinks rationally. Everyone else in the whole world is irrational in their ability to think because of their disbelief in God. And so reason and rationality are actually premised on faith.
Yeah, I love that. And I love the widespread that you gave us. So he wrote newspaper articles, he wrote literary criticism, he wrote fiction, biography. So it's fun to read someone who has that breadth. And I know as a team, we have read some of his more challenging works aloud together just to get into them. So one year as the leadership team, we read Eugenics and Other Evils, which has some good lessons for where we are today. But it is, as you mentioned, good for our students maybe to start with these shorter stories. So we'll talk about these stories themselves. They belong to the specific genre of mystery or detective stories. And Stephanie and I have had more than a few conversations about mysteries because we're both fans. We've read some of the same mysteries together. So Stephanie, tell us a little bit about what are the conventions of this kind of detective fiction or mystery stories?
Sure. Well, starting pretty broad, there's always a crime or a mystery. And then there is usually a character or multiple characters who uncover the answers to all the questions that the readers are asking. And a lot of times that main detective is smarter or wiser or has some special skills that make him able to be a little bit ahead of the reader and the other characters. There's also usually suspects, and oftentimes the person that all the evidence seems to be pointing to at first turns out to be innocent and it's someone else. There's usually riddles of some kind, or a piece of information is misinterpreted or considered irrelevant until later. And then at the end of the story, the detective explains all the little pieces of evidence and how they come together and give us a clear picture of what happened and why.
Yeah, that was a really good description. And I love here that in Father Brown, we have that element in the story we're going to look at today, that we have that kind of element of the curious or the riddle. And also these stories usually have some kind of sidekick. So we're going to meet our villain and our detective and our sidekick today. So that's but it's also fun to me that the story that we're going to look at today is not a murder mystery, because there's murder mysteries abound. And so it's kind of fun to have a mystery that's a riddle about something else and have a story about, a con artist and some theft instead. So good. Are you guys, so Lee and Tim, while we're on this question, do you guys readers of a lot of detective fiction?
I read maybe one or two novels a year that like, a John Grisham novel or something like that. I do a lot of math reading right now.
Yes, you watch a lot. I do know that you watch some mysteries on TV though.
I do watch them on TV. That's my kind of downtime at night. So watch a mystery with my husband. And I can't say I'd recommend any except for a French one called I can think that was called. Tim, tell us what you like. Well, I remember the French series I like.
I will occasionally read a great Agatha Christie mystery because she is the queen of the British mystery. And of course, Poirot is some of my favorite of her work. I love the Poirot mysteries. And then also for fun, if you have been around classical education or classical conversations for very long, you will be familiar with the name Dorothy Sayers. And apart from the wonderful essay that we rely on for a lot of information about the classical renewal. She also wrote a lot of mysteries, and her couple of them that I love the most are Gaudy Night and Strong Poison.
Yes, I like her mysteries and her. I have to derail just a minute to talk about her detective because he's super fun, upper class guy with a butler solving the mysteries, Lord Peter Wimsey. He's very fun. So if you haven't read Sayers mystery fiction, that would be a good place to go. And that's another one who writes about theology and heady subjects and literary criticism, and also writes murder mysteries. So
yeah, I remembered the name. It's called Astrid, and it's reminding me about this book that we're talking about today, because there are two French characters in this story about a English parson, and Astrid is a really great little show to watch. It's mostly family friendly, but because it's in French, you got to be able to read or know French in order to watch it.
I'm gonna have to check it out.
It's good.
All right. So a couple episodes ago, when we started talking about fiction, I always feel compelled on Stephanie's behalf to say spoiler alert. So and then Tim claimed that you can't have spoilers of things that are over 100 years old. And here we are with Father Brown, published in 1911. So just past the 100-year rule for the spoilers. But I just want to say, if you don't want to know what happens in the story, The Blue Cross, now would be a moment for you to press pause, because we're getting ready to talk about a little summary of the plot. So Lee, go ahead and spoil it for our listeners.
Well, I started thinking about it. This is one book of many in this collection of short stories. And so I thought I would explain the basic overall theme of all of them. And that way I don't have a spoiler alert until a little bit later in our conversation. But in all these short stories, you need to pay close attention or you can just miss the plot. I remember I read this book the first time over 20 years ago with my own children, and I had to go back and read it again. It's only 20 pages long, but I was expecting it to be your traditional detective story. And I kept wondering who done it, when really the story is asking you who saw it. And attention is just a really important thing. And so there's this detective Valentine, I think you say his name. And he's always in hot pursuit, or wants to be in hot pursuit of his arch criminal Flambeau. But he doesn't always know where to find him until he runs into a little doe-faced parson. And that tends to be repeated throughout the stories, that our parson, Father Brown, shows up in the most unexpected places and manages to solve the crime for the master detective, Valentine. Is that how you say it? Do one of you know?
Valentine.
Valentine.
I mean, that's the French way to pronounce it. The British are notorious for trampling on French pronunciations on purpose. So I don't know how they pronounce it.
Yeah. So is that enough of a plot summary, or do you want me to tell a little bit more about this?
I think so. I think that's good. And these stories are part of a larger works by Chesterton called The Innocence of Father Brown and The Wisdom of Father Brown, which is a little bit of an echo of the British poet William Blake's Songs of Innocence and Songs of Experience. So we have Father Brown's innocence and his wisdom. And so that's one of those themes that runs through it too, is he seems on the surface to be very naive and innocent, but he is wise as a serpent as well. So yeah, that was a good introduction. So we talked about Dorothy Sayers already. In her speech that she gave, that Tim mentioned, that sparked the classical Christian renewal, her speech was called The Lost Tools of Learning, and it was delivered at Oxford in 1947. And she has a little paragraph in there where she talks about the connections between detective fiction and algebra. But often in British mysteries, either here in Father Brown or ones that are aired often on PBS, we see a connection between detective stories and the church. So I thought you guys could comment on, why is that such a common connection? Why do we have so many priests and pastors and vicars that are solving mysteries? How did that come to be? Anyone have a thought?
Well, I think here go ahead, Stephanie.
I mean, in the case of Father Brown, it's because he's heard a lot of things. He's not himself been around the block, but he has heard about people who have. And so he has kind of a collection of just common schemes and the ways that criminals think. So he has access to that. He's not, saying the names of anyone who's come to confession, but he has heard their stories. And so, and that way the church is connected because his job is to listen to schemes. And so then he can go out in the world, kind of detect the schemes. But I also think that we like to believe, as we should, that the church is concerned with justice and truth. And so tying those together, and having the church be involved in solving crimes and mysteries and finding truth and justice, I love as an idea. And I think maybe that's part of the reason why they get tied together.
Good.
Yeah, I think too, the insight into human nature, right? That those who have studied the Word of God and seen it at work among people know more about the way people really work, not the way that they would think that they work or the way they portray themselves as working on the inside, but really be able to see past sort of the front that men, criminals or otherwise, put on, right, to see truth behind lies or behind the hypocrisy that so often is what we're seeing on the outside.
The other thing is murder mysteries have to do with death. And even the most pagan and heathen of people tend to show up at churches when somebody dies for one reason or another, whether it's the funeral ceremony or some sort of records that are needed, or the actual comfort that the church can offer. So it's not surprising that all those things tie together. I think it's just really also, just the most wonderful thing about what you said earlier, Tim, about the faith and reason being tied together, which we'll meet also in this book in the Blue Cross. It seems so unreal. People will think like Christians who don't believe in aliens are dumb because there's so much out there. How could there not be life on other planets? And we're like, no, we believe there's life on other planets, just not in this universe. Our imaginations are so much bigger than what an atheist's imagination would be, because we have windows into the world beyond us, and people who aren't people of faith are stuck in the walls that they contrive for themselves. Their imaginations don't get to soar as greatly as the Christians does. So I think that's why Chesterton believed that those of faith were the most reasonable and everybody else is irrational. Of course, there's more than ourselves. And how could you not even go through a day without kind of getting that sense? And so Father Brown's very consistent. He always is looking outside of himself for answers.
Yeah, and I think that when we look at this question, so I don't think this is limited to the particular series of detective fiction that I happen to like, but I went to a literary talk a number of years ago that was about Southern writers, and the speaker categorized the South as being Christ haunted. And I thought that was a very apt description. And I find murder mysteries, particularly British ones, to be Christ haunted. And it is because their characters are facing the issues of death. And so even if the detective claims to be an atheist, they're constantly asking questions about the meaning of life and about who God is. And so they are Christ haunted in that same way, because they are dealing with the bigger questions of life and a constant realization that we are mortal. And so in the face of that, they ask questions that maybe other mortals are able to ignore if we just move about our daily business. So I find that interesting too. All right, well, I think it's time for our ad, Lee, so I'll let you thank our sponsor.
Thanks, Jennifer. Yeah, it is time to thank our sponsor, classicalconversationsbooks.com, where the books discussed can be purchased. We have the entire 2023 Words Aptly Spoken calendar at leebortons.com with links to the actual CC book site where it can be purchased. And I love that you just ended that with talking about mortal and immortal. I think one of the things books do is take the ideas that are immortal and actually make them incarnated on that, between words and ink and that piece of paper. In writing, sometimes our children, that's their first glimpse of their own immortality. So make sure you read some of our books as well as join CC in order to let your children experience that. Okay, so next week we're going to discuss Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. And then we mentioned the week after that, we're going to be looking at C.S. Lewis's Mere Christianity. So go ahead and get those books and try to read them. All right, so Jennifer, please get us back into the discussion.
All right. Well, I mentioned this earlier, but there are many, many, many stories about Father Brown. And so I wanted to narrow our discussion because we only have 45 minutes. I wanted to narrow our discussion down to just the one story, which is the first one in the Dover book that we carry. And it is called The Blue Cross. And incidentally, for those of you who do watch Father Brown on TV, this was the only one that they kept the plot of. I don't know why that is. After that, they just went off on their own little trek. So we'll talk about the story, The Blue Cross. And detective fictions, depending on the author, can sometimes be very heavily plot driven. So if you read an author like Agatha Christie, you're only going to get plot. You get to know the characters very, very little. So she usually has a very large cast of suspects, and you don't get to know them a whole lot. But Father Brown is one of those where the personality of each of the main characters really matters in the driving of the story. So we have these three main characters, Father Brown, Flambeau the villain, and Valentin, so that we've talked about. So I thought we would do a close reading and meet each of them as a way of getting into the story. So Stephanie, do you want to introduce us to Father Brown?
Sure. So this quote comes from page 2 of our version. The little priest was so much the essence of those eastern flats. He had a face as round and dull as a Norfolk dumpling. He had eyes as empty as the North Sea. He had several brown paper parcels, which he was quite incapable of collecting. The Eucharistic Congress had doubtless sucked out of their local stagnation many such creatures, blind and helpless like moles disinterred.
Oh, that's a great description. That gives you a good sense of Chesterton's voice too. He doesn't usually pull any punches. So let's look at that first comparison. He has a face as round and dull as a Norfolk dumpling. What did that make you guys think of?
I mean, I don't know what a Norfolk dumpling is, but I've had Chinese dumplings and other dumplings, and they're just, very, very round and plain and unassuming. Nothing threatening about a little dumpling.
Yeah, they're sort of comfort food, no matter where you're talking about them, whether it's, the American South or Chinese restaurants. They're comfort food that mom would make at home. So good.
It's also the description of that is it's round and dull. So it's not like as he's engaging with people who don't know him that he automatically shines. Mm-hmm. His presence is minimal.
Yeah, which might actually be helpful if you're detecting mysteries. You want to be the one noticing things in people. You don't necessarily want to be noticed.
Right.
Did you have a thought about that comparison, Tim?
Yeah, it just strikes me as so contrary to like the descriptions of Sherlock Holmes, right? Who's this dashing character, and Father Brown is easily overlooked and not remarkable for anything except for his unremarkability.
Yeah.
Kind of reminds me of Miss Marple, Agatha Christie's Miss Marple, who's just this very unassuming little old lady who people don't ever think is going to do anything crazy or have any great insights, but she's just a flower, in the corner who's seeing everything and puts things together. So
yeah, she pulls out her knitting. So she's got her knitting. He's got his priest's habit, that he wears. Good. So the next thing that Chesterton says is he has eyes that are as empty as the North Sea. What in the world?
Yeah, I think that's referring to the color of the North Sea, that they are gray eyes, because the North Sea itself can be raging, right, in a storm. But I think that it's always this monotone, or to say always, but you imagine it always being this monotone color where the sea and the sky don't have much difference because they're so gray.
Yeah, I was also thinking that you've got two things that are near and would be familiar to Chesterton's British audience. So this is also establishing that he is just a typical English priest. So he's been compared to Norfolk, which is one of the English counties, and now to the North Sea. to kind of establishing him as a very, very recognizable British figure.
Mhm.
So, yeah. All right. So next he has several brown paper parcels, which he is quite incapable of collecting.
I think we all know that person, right? Who's constantly collecting and dropping the things that they're picking up.
Yes.
And it's disarming, right? It's that thing that if you see someone doing that, you think that they're just hopeless, and you don't pay attention because it's sort of that sign of absent-mindedness or incapacity.
It's certainly not a threat.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah. Absent-minded professor was the first thing that came to my mind too. It's just,
I think this is also a good sentence for students to read, because oftentimes they mistake a character description with a character sketch. And the description might be where you said he was pale skinned with gray eyes and he was bumbling. But this sentence helps you see how to actually sketch that out, to make it bigger, to make the description part of the story and not just a few adjectives.
Yeah, I think that's good. It also places him in another set of characters where I've read quite a few of these stories now where there were female spies in World War I and II, and they would often employ this device where they would get to a train station and pretend to be fumbling in their handbags for things to disarm whoever they were trying to slip by. If they didn't have the correct papers or whatever, they'd spill their purse and spend all this time trying to collect it up and hope that the person would just send them on out of the way. So he's in good company there too.
Well, that one phrase sets you up for the whole rest of the story.
Yeah, and what were you seeing there specifically?
Oh, because he's quite incapable of collecting. He's bumbling. And you're going to see that all the clues he gives throughout the next 20 pages are things that the locals just think he's being bumbling, where he's being very clever.
Yes, and the whole mystery does in fact turn around a brown paper parcel as well. So there's quite a few little hints here. Well, let's look at that last sentence. The Eucharistic Congress had doubtless sucked out of their local stagnation many such creatures, blind and helpless like moles disinterred. So what about this sentence?
I think Tim should answer. I'm not sure I even know what that means.
This is just lovely. I mean, the Eucharistic Congress is that Roman Catholic sort of conclave where all the local, the regional gathering of the priests and clergy. And I love it because it's sort of that idea that they've all been sort of in their own little worlds doing their own little things, and now they're sort of pulled out into the light and sort of looking around and blinking. It reminds me of the opening to with The Wind in the Willows, where Mole comes out into the spring sunlight. But like moles disinterred, right? They've been unburied from their burrows, and again, that sort of helpless is right there, right? They're blind and helpless. That appearance just of utter lack of threat to anyone, that he's the one who needs help. He's never going to be helping anybody.
Yeah, and these aren't the shining stars. They aren't the power figures of the church, authority or hierarchy structure. They are being sucked out of their local stagnation. So these are the backwater guys that are in their little parishes, happy with their little, smaller issues. So, all right. So Lee, do you want to introduce us to the very funny villain, the Frenchman Flambeau?
Yeah, I love his name, Flambeau. He was a Gascon of gigantic stature and bodily daring, and the wildest tales were told of his outbursts of athletic humor, how he turned the jeu d'instruction upside down and stood him on his head to clear his mind, how he ran down the Rue de Rivoli with a policeman under each arm. It is due to him to say that his fantastic physical strength was generally employed in such bloodless though undignified scenes. His real crimes were chiefly those of ingenious and wholesale robbery. But each of his thefts was almost a new sin and would make a story by itself. It was he who ran the great Tyrolean Dairy Company in London, with no dairies, no cows, no carts, no milk, but with some 1,000 subscribers. These he served by the simple operation of moving the little milk cans outside people's doors to the doors of his own customers.
So Stephanie, as we were reading that, I noticed that you're laughing. What kind of a picture are you having in your mind of Flambeau, or what did that description do for you?
I mean, it's so funny, and we're supposed to think that it's funny. I mean, he is a criminal, but his crimes are just clever and absurd. So I'm picturing, I don't even know what this cartoon character is. It might be the bad guy in Frosty, but just like this little almost magician guy with like an evil mustache going around doing these weird little schemes. And just his whole milk operation of having no dairies, no cows, no carts, no milk, and somehow making money off of this just by stealing milk from some houses and putting it outside others. It's just funny. Yeah.
Yeah. And that slapstick element of him carrying a policeman under each arm and running down the street is like, it's a great image. So he's yeah. What about you, Tim? You're nodding. What did you think when you were hearing it?
Yeah, I mean, he's the polar opposite of Father Brown, right? Father Brown's this little, unremarkable, unassuming, steady as she goes, stuck in his stagnant backwater kind of guy. And here you have Flambeau, who's flamboyant, right? In every way. He's big, he's strong, he's athletic, he's humorous, he's out and about, he's everywhere and nowhere at the same time. He's ingenious and recognizably so. Like, people know who he is. And though through all of this, again, this idea of athletic humor, which is a funny turn of phrase, and this bloodlessness, right? That he's not a violent criminal. He's almost more of a character than he is a true villain.
Well, he reminds me of a villain from Wall Street running a scam, right? He's a Ponzi scheme guy.
Yeah.
So he doesn't need to have any blood. He just wants to make the money. And I think he just wants to be more clever than anybody else.
Yeah, and I think that is some of the charm of these, and why they're good to read with our students is that this is light and fun. It is not dark like some mystery novels. This is not what you would call a purely evil villain. So it's a good introduction, I think, to the mystery.
Well, and also there's an assumption, I'm proud of Stephanie, but I know it's because she reads so much, that kids will know what moving the milk around was like. I'm old enough that we actually had the milk delivered at our door when I was a child. But today's children may go, what does that even mean? And so it gives us a chance to share about our own family's heritage.
Yeah, that's good. All right, so Tim, our third, so we have our villain, and I don't know, we'll have to talk about whether Father Brown is the detective or the sidekick to the detective, but the officially named detective is the Frenchman Aristide Valentin. So tell us about him.
All right, so this is just a couple pages after we get the description of Father Brown in page 4. It says, Aristide Valentin was unfathomably French, and the French intelligence is intelligence specifically and solely. He was not a thinking machine, for that is a brainless phrase of modern fatalism and materialism. A machine only is a machine because it cannot think. But he was a thinking man, and a plain man at the same time. All his wonderful successes that looked like conjuring had been gained by plodding logic, by clear and commonplace French thought.
Yeah, so sometimes you get a gift when you're working on things and it all comes together. I happened to be giving a Latin talk at a conference last week, and I talked about this very idea, which I was quoting Tracy Lee Simmons from the book Climbing Parnassus about classical education, that classical educators were not interested in informing thinking machines. And so when I got to reread Father Brown on the plane, I thought, what a gift that I got to see this again in a wholly different light. So what do you make of all this? It's kind of philosophical here in the middle of the description of our detective.
Well, that's because he is philosophical. I also find it very Chesterton, this paragraph, because he would not like us to use analogies about people that reduce us to machines. He very much loved the holistic man and the imagination of mankind and the gifts and talents we had. So you meet Chesterton while you're meeting, I want to say it, Aristide Valentine. Is that right?
I think if you're saying it the French way, you have to get that last syllable through the nose. Valentin.
Okay. Anyway.
Oh, good. What about you guys' thoughts?
I like the comparison, the contrast that a thinking machine is brainless, right? It's a brainless phrase. So I think he's pretty clearly trying to separate the fact that the human intellect is something more, not just more in scale. It's not like just the most complicated computer, like you'll hear that talked about these days, right? The human mind is just the most advanced computer on the planet. No, it's something more. It's uniquely human, right? It's been given to us by God, and it's not just a machine that does input and output. It does more things than that, and there, right? That what looks like conjuring had been gained by plotting logic, right? That he's using the gifts that God gave, that reason, that rational thinking, to work his way through something that's seemingly magical, but really is just commonplace. It's just a lot of it.
Yeah, and a thinking machine is not capable. We talked about the fact that these come from books called The Innocence of Father Brown and The Wisdom of Father Brown. Thinking machines aren't capable of being wise. They can deal with large amounts of data, but that is not to say that they can be wise or make decisions. Or we use this expression all the time, thinking outside the box. So Father Brown is really good at thinking outside the box. And of course, Flambeau is as well. So it's
well, just how we read the words for all three of them was different and gave you the character, the funny and flamboyant named Flambeau, and this name that's a little bit hard to pronounce and very philosophical and heady, and then our pudgy little pale person. How about that for a bunch of peas? And their paragraphs describe them with the resonance of the words themselves help you to know who he is, which once again shows as classical homeschoolers, the joy of all these books is to be reading them out loud. There's so much more you get out of it than when you read it by yourself.
Yeah, and that's what this is a nice one to do with this. The stories are very short and you can read them to your whole family. So Stephanie, I said earlier in the episode, who is the real detective here? Is it Father Brown? Is it Valentin? What's your opinion on this?
So funny, because when I was talking about the components of a mystery and we have like the detective or detectives, I was thinking about this story in particular. And, in my head, as I was speaking, my brain was like, wait, who would I cast as these roles in this story? I don't know. I mean, I don't know if we can call Valentin the sidekick, because he doesn't quite do anything. He's following the whole time. And at the end, spoiler, he does kind of come in with the police and arrest Flambeau, we assume. But he doesn't do much. Man, y'all are just witnessing me thinking out loud. He does detect, because he's following the trails that Father Brown has left, but Father Brown has laid the clues. So I mean, I guess Valentin is the detective, but I would not call Father Brown the sidekick. So I don't know what to do with that.
It's interesting as you said that I saw this in a new light and another layer of Chesterton making it comedic, because Flambeau is leaving clues that Father Brown picks up, and then Father Brown is leaving clues for the detectives to find so that they can come and help him, because he's not going to be able to stand up against this giant Gascon. He can't physically deal with him. He can mentally outsmart him. So there's that's that almost like a Shakespearean plot where there are two villains and two heroes, right? It's the multiplication. Here we have two sets of clues being left. one for the first detective and one for the second detective.
I want to kind of defend Valentin though, because he really did attend. He knew something was afoot, but he didn't know what it was. And he found very simple things, mistakes people don't make, but are part of everyday life, like switching sugar and salt, to give away one of them. He really was attending to what the clues were.
Yeah, and there was one quote that stood out to me about that, because Valentin says that he is just almost going at it at random because he doesn't have any clues to follow. There's a quote, Valentin said that if one had a clue, this was the worst way, but if one had no clue at all, it was the best, because there was just the chance that any oddity that caught the eye of the pursuer might be the same that had caught the eye of the pursued. And so he really harnesses this, I don't have anything to go off of, so I'm just open, and he's attending.
And that's part of the whole theology, is that there's lots of mysteries we can't see, but we know they're there. We know it's going to happen. And so we need to be open and attending to them.
Yeah, I think too that the difference is that Valentin is always looking with his eyes. He's always looking for the clues. He's always looking for the thing that's out of place. And in doing so, he does gain, by plotting logic, everything he needs to arrive at the place where Father Brown and Flambeau are together, right, in the countryside. But it's Father Brown who solves it first. He's the one who makes the intuitive leap to know things about Flambeau that Valentin doesn't ever really arrive at. So you have this sort of intuitive detective character in Father Brown, and this logic-based visual detective in Valentin that is they're both pursuing the same thing, but they're pursuing them very differently.
Which is a good description of the two sides of human nature, right? So I was thinking as you were talking, Tim, because I just finished an Agatha Christie novel, and that is very much the same situation with Hercule Poirot, who is sitting around in his armchair solving the mystery. But at the same time, the police are doing their work, and both are needed to resolve this particular one that I just read. It was called The Clocks, but it's so both of those things are necessary. Well, good. All right. Well, we keep dancing. First of all, I want to say I'm very proud of us. We did not give a spoiler. So readers, no cause for alarm. We've just said salt and sugar being mixed up. It's about a Blue Cross. So you might guess that the Blue Cross is the mystery. We said it's not a murder mystery, it's theft. And there's all these weird things going on, like soup being thrown at the wall and placards for fruit and nuts being mixed up. So hopefully we've made you very curious to read it, but I did want to read something from the end, which gets us back to our question about mysteries and theology. So I'll read this conversation between Flambeau and Father Brown. "How in blazes do you know all these horrors?" cried Flambeau. The shadow of a smile crossed the round, simple face of his clerical opponent. "Oh, by being a celibate simpleton, I suppose," Father Brown says. "Has it never struck you that a man who does next to nothing but hear men's real sins is not likely to be wholly unaware of human evil? But as a matter of fact, another part of my trade too made me sure you weren't a priest." "What?" asked the thief, almost gaping. "You attacked reason," said Father Brown. "It's bad theology." What did you guys make of that scene?
Well, just for our listeners, it might help them to know that throughout this short story, Flambeau is pretending to be a priest.
Yes, and so this is one of the ways Father Brown knew he wasn't, is because he attacked reason. Why is that bad theology? What's he saying here?
As I mentioned earlier, Chesterton was an enormous fan, follower of Thomas Aquinas, who was really the great systematizer, right? He was the one who sought to reconcile reason and faith, and Aristotle and Augustine, and he was very much convinced that no true understander of Catholic Christian theology could possibly deny reason as being as binding as a principle on man as theology is, as faith is. And so when he heard Flambeau in disguise casting aspersions upon reason, he knew that he couldn't also be a good priest while attacking reason, which is sort of counterintuitive to what most of us would think about the way that a priest might talk about human reason as being secondary or even unimportant compared to faith.
Good.
It's a curious thing to do, to have a little explanatory gloss on Thomas Aquinas in a little murder short story. I like that. That's clever of Chesterton. I think we may be out of time, Lee. Is that true?
Yeah, so one thing that's interesting is this is actually the very last sentence of the story. And once again, it shows Chesterton, he doesn't explain it. He expects you to pay attention and think about what's going on. So thanks for introducing all these great ideas to us, Jennifer and Stephanie and Tim. Thanks for being here. Everyone, let's just thank you for listening and keep reading, and let's keep the conversations going. See you all next week.
Bye, guys.
Bye.